Welcome to Regulated and Relational, a bi-monthly podcast brought to you by the Attachment and Trauma Network. In this foundational episode of Regulated and Relational, Ginger and Julie dive deep into attachment disorders, what they are, how they're diagnosed, and the realities families face when raising children with these challenges. Let's learn more.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Regulated and Relational, our podcast produced by the Attachment and Trauma Network. I'm Ginger Healy.
And I'm Julie Beam.
And we're excited to share with you from both our personal experiences and our professional knowledge what it truly means to be attachment-focused, trauma-informed, and how we can help children impacted by early childhood trauma. Today's topic is a foundational one for the Attachment and Trauma Network, and that's to dive into exactly what are attachment disorders. It's fitting that in ATN's 30th year of existence, we talk candidly and comprehensively about the reason that our nonprofit was founded. And that reason was reactive attachment disorder, or RAD for short. In 1995, when parents started connecting to support each other in Kansas City, an effort that quickly spread around the country, it was because their children had been diagnosed with RAD. And this diagnosis, what it actually is and what to do about it, has been elusive ever since. So we're going to start this conversation with where we are officially right now as far as diagnosis and criteria, and then talk about the realities of what attachment disorders look like in the children who have them and the families and adults who care for and love these children.
Yes, let's start by saying that out of all the kinds of mental health issues, attachment disorders are under-researched. And that's what's leading to some of their misunderstanding, right? Even by psychologists, therapists, and counselors. There are a lot of psychologists, therapists, and counselors out there who tell you they just don't know much about attachment disorder. And a lot that may tell you they do know things, but may not be up to date, right? Part of this under-researchedness may be due to the fact that there's no medication answer to an attachment disorder. So like other disorders that are taken care of, like ADHD with medication, they're like the other trauma-based disorders and those with neurodiversity, and there's no pharmaceutical answer, if you will. And so because there's no obvious pharmaceutical answer for this disorder, then that means there's not pharmaceutical funding to push the research. So that may be part of the reason that it's under-researched. So this leads to not knowing about the prevalence of attachment disorders. So if you start like researching how prevalent are they, and you hear lots of people say, oh, they're really rare. No, they're not rare at all. You hear all of that, or at least we do at ATN, right? Yeah. But the prevailing belief is that about 1% to 2% of the general population has an attachment disorder. And this was published by the National Institute of Health in 2023. However, there are lots of studies out there that focus on children who have histories of neglect and maltreatment, and that puts the prevalence much, much, much higher at 38 to 40%. And in a 2024 study of young people who were in prison, the attachment disorder rate was found to be 75%. So those people we already know, those children we already know that have a lot of adversities, a high A score, if you will, lots of early childhood trauma and impacts, have a much, much higher prevalence. This overall lack of research that has happened over the whole 30 years that ATN has been in existence has led to a lot of misinformation and not clear information about reactive attachment disorder. Some people, like I said before, they find it, they say that it's very rare, so then they don't diagnose it unless it's just so obvious. Others say that it's been overdiagnosed, or they say it's been overdiagnosed. Some others say that it's been underdiagnosed, and every time they meet somebody who's a foster child or has, is not living with their original family, then they lean towards that diagnosis. So there's just this mixed bag, right? And wide variables on that, and also on interventions and prognoses. And so that really leads to a lot of confusion.
Right. Yeah. The DSM-5, that is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, version 5, and that's the book that is used to diagnose mental health disorders. That's where you find where we can look at attachment disorders. It now lists them under trauma-related disorders, and that was a huge step forward for attachment disorders. That happened in 2013. Now, when ATN started in 1995, professionals hadn't connected RAD to trauma in any way. In fact, the prevailing understanding on early childhood trauma and lifelong impacts was just in its infancy. The ACEs studies were just occurring for the first time. And while we consider the ACE study groundbreaking and foundational to the entire movement, we didn't know about it when we started. No one had connected the dots between trauma, relational trauma, and attachment disorders.
Right. So in the beginning, what we did know was that children in foster care and adopted internationally seemed to be the ones that were more susceptible to having reactive attachment disorder. We had no idea how prevalent it was or truly understood why it happened, except that the attachment theorists that were back in the 1950s and beyond, people like John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth and Mary Main, and we've talked about some of them on the podcast before, they pointed out that the significant neglect and adversity in infancy and early childhood caused this disorganized attachment that became the attachment disorders. But without the connection between attachment disorders and trauma, it was really easy to misinterpret the motives of the children and the reasons why the children behaved they did that they did, and it was easy for us as parents. I'm speaking for myself and others, and also for the therapists and the professionals who were trying to help us to misinterpret what was really going on underneath the behaviors. And you and I both know we've talked about looking underneath those behaviors for years and years and years, all through this podcast, right? And we didn't know to do that and didn't know how to do that.
Yeah. And so I do think it's important that we gave you all of that history. I think it's absolutely fascinating. But for you, the listener, what we feel like is the most important piece is to understand where we are with attachment disorders now. And as we said, currently the DSM-5, in the DSM-5, there are 2 attachment disorders found under trauma-related disorders. So that is first reactive attachment disorder, and then disinhibited social engagement disorder. These 2 disorders are 2 of 5 disorders in that category. The others are PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, acute stress disorder, and adjustment disorder. Now, while the changes made to PTSD in the new DSM are important, including adding a dissociative subtype and a preschool subtype that recognizes PTSD symptoms are different in children than adults, we think that the DSM-5 got a couple of things really wrong. First off, we think that splitting the attachment disorder diagnosis RAD into 2 diagnoses, reactive attachment disorder and disinhibited social engagement disorder, has made things more confusing.
Exactly. And second, we were dismayed that they rejected and did not include the proposed developmental trauma disorder that's been proposed and researched by Dr. Bessel van de Kolk and many of the folks that work around him. They've done the research and they proposed this, and it so much better links the developmental delays that we often see in relational trauma. And we know anecdotally from the children that we serve and that we reach that these are important things to notice as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go back to talking about splitting the diagnosis, because prior to the DSM, RAD was the only attachment diagnosis that had two subtypes, inhibited and disinhibited. So in order to understand the differences, we have to be clear on what RAD, or attachment disorders, are. RAD is caused by a lack of inadequate caregiving. To get to the diagnosis, it's important that it can be documented that the child has extremes or insufficient care due to things like neglect, changing of primary caregivers, or severely limited opportunities to form attachments, which includes things like being raised in orphanages or other institutions. This care is presumed to be responsible for the other criteria, which are being emotionally withdrawn behavior toward caregivers, not seeking comfort when distressed, and or not responding to that comfort when distressed. Also, not being socially or emotionally responsive to others, and having a limited positive affect, which in non-psychological speak means not exhibiting happiness or joy, positive emotions, or at least very infrequently. And episodes of unexplained irritability, sadness, and or fearfulness during non-threatening interaction with adult caregivers.
Right. For those of you living with someone with RAD, these criteria may sound a little benign. You're like listening to it going, yeah, check. You're probably thinking about all the behaviors and the symptoms that you see and thinking that this sounds so clinical. And we'll get to that. We'll get to what it looks like in our families. But first, let's circle back and talk about this new attachment disorder, the disengagement. See, it's such a mouthful. I can't even get it right. The Disinhibited Social Engagement Disorder. There we go. DSED. DSED is caused by the same lack of adequate caregiving. The same insufficient care is the criteria that's listed there, right? And in this case, the pattern, instead of being inhibited or withdrawn, is disinhibited, meaning that the child is much more likely to approach strangers and interact with unfamiliar adults, to become overly familiar quickly, to not check back and with any concern about whether their adult caregiver is there as they venture away, to be willing to go off with strangers, basically. And also there's a criterion of impulsivity that goes with DSED. Just like RAD, DSED cannot be diagnosed in a child until they've reached the developmental age of at least 9 months. But unlike RAD, DSED doesn't have the rule out of autism. In RAD, the criteria actually states that autism must be ruled out as a diagnosis, which on the surface makes some sense, right? Because if you're talking about being withdrawn and isolated, sometimes those are autistic traits, right? Especially if you can't document the insufficient care, it looks like it's part of the child's neurodiversity. But things become more complex really quickly when a child is developmentally impacted, shows both signs of neurodiversity and autism, and presents with that trauma history and that insufficient care, which believe it or not, folks, unless you're living with it, you probably haven't thought about that, but there's a lot of us out there who are having
I was going to say that. Right? I sure have, yeah.
And what we know about the impacts of neglect and abuse and other diversities on developing brains, we know that many of the signs and symptoms that are often found in children with autism can also be found in children with attachment disorders. And many parents and professionals are often left to wonder, which is it? Is it a yes either or is it a yes and? And And there's a lot of information not really clear out there to guide us in all of this. We, of course, at ATM believe that it can coexist. And this is exactly where we were with my daughter. And it was obvious that she was emotionally withdrawn, not connected to us in a healthy attachment way, was not easily comforted by us as a toddler. She had a history of profound neglect. So exploring an attachment disorder made sense, but there was many other things. She had slow language development. She had all kinds of incredible sensory issues. She had both overreacting and underreacting to stimuli. And she had a host of auditory and visual processing challenges that we just had to unpack over time. So which was it, attachment disorder or autism? And, being 25 years in, we believe that it's both. I mean, at this point, we've peeled the layers of the onion enough to believe that she has both issues going on for her. But we were often led by professionals to believe that it had to be one or the other, and neither one of those was a correct fit for us. The thing that bothers me about splitting the attachment disorder diagnosis into two, the inhibited and the disinhibited, is that it further confuses this issue for those of us with children who are significantly impacted, because let's face it, attachment disorders are confusing, and in many circles they're considered controversial, so people don't want to talk about them. And some children, mine included, and I know others, have exhibited throughout their development both the inhibited and the disinhibited forms of the attachment disorder, right? In fact, when I was doing research for this podcast and trying to find out what made them decide to split the two, I found research from Dr. Charles Zana in 2004, and he's really one of the foremost attachment disorder researchers out there, that said the two sides of RAD, the inhibited and the disinhibited, were not independent. So even in the research, they were aware that sometimes children could present both ways, right? Early on, my daughter rejected much of the nurturing I tried to provide, and she really wasn't able to be comforted by anybody, right? She didn't want to be rocked or held or cuddled or any of those things. But she also would, for lack of a better term, mom shop. And there were times that she was prone to declaring loudly in a public setting, "You're not my mom, you go away," right? "Just get away from me." And this was particularly problematic for us as a family because one time in particular, because I don't look like her at all, one of the patrons there was, promptly reporting me to security. She thought I was that I was going to do something dangerous, which, we want people to report dangerous adults for children, but it was, how do you explain that? And I know that I'm not the only one that ends up that. Her being quick to mom shop, to look for other adults to engage with, to just start approaching and following a strange adult in many situations. This is the disinhibited behavior. And teachers and others who work with small children, sometimes you recognize that, right? You just start to realize that there's something up with this kid. All of a sudden, they're too engaging. They're overly charming. They're like right there next to you. They might become super clingy. And you're like, well, I don't even know this kid, right? And sometimes you don't necessarily. You just think, oh, what a sweet little kid. And then you get to reflecting on it and you're like, there could be something up here, right? And over the 3 decades of supporting families with ATN, I know that my child was not the only one that exhibited both of these things. And anytime that we split a diagnosis into two, it makes it so much harder to get the diagnosis and then to get the right treatment. So I'm thinking they didn't do us any help on the attachment disorders. And when we talk at ATN about, and we use the term attachment disorders, we do it on purpose because now there are two, and it's important that we talk about them both. So the unusual relational behaviors are really the hallmark, right? When we talk about attachment disorders, aren't they? And for years, these behaviors, they've been labeled as charming, manipulative, rejecting. And while those are accurate descriptions of what those behaviors feel like and what they do, they feel like relationally to those of us on the receiving end of the behaviors, as Ginger always teaches us to look under the behaviors, it's the why, what's underneath that we don't really understand. We don't have to look very far into the internet about attachment disorder before we start to get, all kinds of interesting symptoms. Just Google RAD and you're going to see things like manipulative, lacks empathy, superficially charming, has no impulse control, unexplained sadness, fear, or anger, is bossy, has to be in control. And while these behaviors are true, I mean, I'm not saying they're not. We see them, right? Many of our children do exhibit them. That's still not the why. Why are they these things? And that's what we need to understand.
Yeah. And when we recognize that there is an attachment disorder, we know this particular child is going to need intensive amounts of therapeutic parenting, and the family is going to need strong, consistent support from their community, along with therapists, support for the child at school, that we have to be in for the long haul. One of the most discouraging things about getting an attachment disorder diagnosis is that it often comes with a huge dose of despair. Many will talk about how bleak the prognosis is and how unlikely it is that the child will progress toward healing. So I just want to be clear that I'm not saying that RAD and DSED are easy conditions to parent by any means, and that healing is assured, but there are so many things that can be done to help these children and their families. I've seen too much progress in so many children and families to look at this as a hopeless cause. The key is to recognize that help is needed as quickly as possible. This isn't something to sit back on and let time try to fix this, right? As quickly as possible, find an attachment-focused, trauma-informed therapist and learn how to parent in a therapeutic way. What needs to happen for these children are frequent, consistent opportunities for them to get opportunities to bond with their caregivers now, to replace what didn't happen earlier in their life. And that can be challenging based on many factors. The child's age comes to mind first, right? Being intentionally nurturing with a 16-year-old doesn't look like what you would do, for a child when they're 6 months old or 6 years old. But it has to be something that this child's nervous system can tolerate. So I just want to spend a second on my favorite thing, talking about pacing and dosing, because it's not overwhelming when you understand you don't have to fix it all at once in heavy intensity. In fact, you need to go at the child's pace, not pushing, not where you're watching for signs of when they're needing you to stop or slow down, and doing this relational positive interaction in small doses. Children heal at the speed of trust. So if we go too fast, too hard, the child may reject your attempts to be nurtured. So build trust, focus on the relationship, not the behavior, and really try to attune to what they can tolerate and when you need to slow down, back off, right? We're slowly stretching that window of tolerance. So pacing and dosing.
Great advice. And I'm also glad that you injected some hope, Ginger, because getting an attachment disorder diagnosis and starting on this journey can be so overwhelming. And that's where we hear from a lot of families, is right at that critical point. Finding your support system, other families who've walked through this diagnosis, is critical. So
yes.
So if you're out there with a child diagnosed with a reactive attachment disorder or DSED, and you don't have a support system, it's time to start building one. This was the founding mission of ATN, and we still do have an online parent support group here and other parenting programs. But we also know that over the last 30 years, the landscape has changed a little bit. And this is encouraging from my perspective. We know that there are many more resources available locally, often found in foster and post-adoptive care systems, right? That where there's a high prevalence of attachment disorders in their populations. And so they've gotten better in their post-adoptive and their foster parent support to have support, education, and even more wraparound services to help with that long haul therapeutic parenting. So it's highly recommended. We highly recommend that you look there first, right? Look locally first for what's around you, because you need good therapists, you need good support group, you need to know what services are available. And of course, you can do both. You can look locally, and you can also join us at ATN. And there are also other resources out there on a variety of bases.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we want to actually address the hallmarks of why children with RAD and DSED do the things they do. And we also don't want you to leave this episode without us talking some more about developmental trauma disorder.
Hi, Lauren here. Are you looking for a way to show the world that you're becoming trauma-informed? Are you a school principal, team leader, or office manager wondering how to get your whole staff started on this trauma-informed journey? ATN's Trauma-Informed Certification was designed with you in mind. This online certification is for anyone who wants to apply trauma-informed principles to your care of children. This 3-unit course takes about 5 hours to complete, with videos, interactive knowledge checks, and downloadable notes. Once all 3 units are complete with a score of 80% or above, you receive your certificate and certification badge to share your accomplishment with all your friends and colleagues. This Level 1 certification never expires. And for those of you who have been working in trauma-informed care for a while, there's a test out option that allows you to obtain this credential without the coursework. Now is a great time to join me in documenting your trauma-informed knowledge with ATN's Level 1 Trauma-Informed Certification. Additional certification levels are currently under development to further your journey and will be available in 2026.
Hi, we're back, and today's topic is attachment disorders. We want to dive underneath the hallmark behaviors of RAD and DSED to start to understand the why, which usually helps us in better responding to children's behaviors, right? So let's start with, why do children with attachment disorders try to manipulate all the adults?
Oh, good question. I think to begin to understand that child's nearly compulsive need to manipulate, to control, really, we have to recognize what it feels like to have this level of disorganized attachment. When we're teaching the attachment cycle and talking about how trauma and toxic stress disrupt this cycle, it's easy to see why both healthy attachment is important for us to develop in infancy, and why it's detrimental when a child doesn't get the attuned, repetitive meeting of their needs. But we often don't think about what this sets them up for in terms of their inner working model. That's the belief they have about themselves. And I know we've talked about this in an episode a couple seasons ago, but here's the reminder. When you have not had your early needs met, you start to shape an inner belief, like, I don't matter, I'm not important enough or worthy enough to be loved. No one cares about me, therefore I have to take care of myself, or nothing I do matters to anybody else. From these two basic views, you can start believing that one way to take care of yourself is by controlling as much as you can, especially when it comes to relationships and interactions. That's starting to make sense, right? So if it's easier to now think about that young child who has been in 9 foster placements, having an overwhelming need to control things because their relational life has been chaos. So many changes up to this point. And that child truly doesn't have the basis to believe that they can trust you. Why would they? Even if they started to build a positive relationship with their last caregiver, that relationship ended, likely abruptly, and their belief system says it's because nobody cares about me. Adults can't be trusted.
So manipulation then is always a bid for controlling the situation, an attempt to do that, right? And yes, it's exhausting when you're the caregiver or the adult in charge caring for a child who's always trying to control and manipulate everything. It is exhausting. But it does help for you to see that it is about the control and about not feeling safe and not being able to trust the adults in their world, even though you know you have their best interest at heart, right? So what can we do when we have a child that is trying to manipulate and control everything? What's a good practice?
Yeah. The two things that come to mind are to give them limited choices, right? Choices that you can live with. Things like, do you want to wear the blue shirt or the red shirt? Okay. Now, our children that come with attachment disorders might respond with, I want to wear the yellow dress, or I don't want to wear any shirt, right? Or anything you say, I'm going to disagree with. That's not uncommon. And it's also why children with attachment disorders often carry an oppositional defiance disorder diagnosis. They can definitely be oppositional when given choices. Still, limited choices offered consistently and calmly over time will help because it provides boundaries and structures that ultimately feel safe to their nervous system. So, do you want to clean up the toys now or after your snack? Of course, the option that the child may take is, I don't want to clean up my toys at all. But that's not an option that you're giving. That's where we hold the boundary and often need to do it with them, right? Scaffold, model, adjust our expectations, avoid the power struggle. And the other thing is that I feel like it's really important to describe your motives and what you're doing and why you're doing it. So this can sound like saying, I'm the mom, and I'm going to make sure that all my children have healthy food at every meal. I'm your parent, and I love you so much that I want to make sure your teeth don't get cavities, right? I'm doing this because I want to and need you to be safe. I want to keep you safe. So it's really about making your implicit care that you're giving to this child very explicit. You're actually labeling what you're doing as actions that a parent who cares for their child will do.
Yeah, it reminds me of two things. It's like a version of name it to tame it, right? Where you name something and then it takes away its power, or it introduces the idea of the motive so that it's clear on what you're thinking. But it also reminds me a little bit of how you sometimes parent toddlers, right? The toddlers who are in that why stage where they're running around going, why? When you tell them to do something, why? So one of the things you can do there is exactly this. Say, I'm the parent and this is what, and I'm doing these things. And your child doesn't have to be asking why. The manipulation and the attempt to take control really is kind of asking, the why are you doing this to me? And you're making it very explicit, what your motivations are. And that disrupts the child's belief systems that nobody cares about them because or that you're doing this to restrict them or punitive or because you don't like them or that you're trying to push them away or any of the other negative belief systems that seem to come up there. I love it.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. Okay, and let me also be clear that neither of those things that I just talked about are going to work immediately or are going to work all the time.
Right.
But what this does is it starts to like you said, it starts to challenge that child's negative belief systems and expresses intention. It helps you also focus your intention. I'm being a good mother to this child by giving them limited choices with a boundary, and I'm holding that boundary. I'm intentionally focusing on taking care of this child by the choices I make, right? It helps us to stay grounded and focused when their behaviors are oftentimes really overwhelming and can be dysregulating to our adult nervous system, right? And you can also just call out the behavior in a non-judgmental way, but you're reframing it. So, for example, I see you're trying to make this happen because you might be worried that you're not going to get what you need. I am so sorry that you have not had someone taking care of this for you in the past. I'm here and I will make sure you get what you need. I think those conversations are important. And again, lots of caveats here. You know that for most of these children who have experienced trauma and have experienced challenges in relationships and so their attachment, their brains are often, if not always at first, in fight or flight mode, right? So they're going to push back on whatever you're doing, complaining, rejecting, trying to control. But what you're saying aloud is as much for you as it is for them.
Yeah.
It's to remind you why they're doing what they're doing and why you're doing what you're doing. So you're both modeling and moving them toward a more healthy relationship.
Right.
And really, you as the adult are the strategy. So it is for you. And that is not selfish. That is so important. And we also know that what our children often present as a need, and then they get locked in on trying to control it as a want. Sometimes we have to say no to what they want, especially if it's something they don't need. We have to work hard not to get in power struggles. I probably can't say that enough, right? Because, and here's something that when I learned it changed everything for me. These kids' brains are often habitualized to chaos, right? That means that their brains feel most normal when there's a fight, when there's chaos and lots of drama happening. It's familiar to them. So it's predictable to them. And predictability feels safe. It's counterintuitive as all of this is. Part of their manipulation can be attempts to create chaos because that's what their use-dependent brain is used to. It feels normal. So when we're calm and confident and compassionate toward them, yes, absolutely, we should be. And that's so important in the long run. To them, it can actually feel abnormal and it can feel scary because for children coming from hard places, that is new. So change and newness can feel uncontrollable and scary.
There's so much wisdom in that, Ginger. I hope everybody might like even back it up and listen to it again, because and if you haven't heard some of that thought process and those strategies before, it sounds very counterintuitive, but it's so true. It's so true about their brains being used to that chaos and actually kind of trying to make the chaos happen so that it feels normal to them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So we need to mention triangulation because it's something that happens so often, and it's such a problem for our children with attachment disorders. And one of those survival skills that has developed for many of these children is to pit adults against each other. That also helps drive the chaos, right? So it's easy to see how they get how they get there, given their belief that no one cares about them and that adults can't be trusted. One way to go about this is to manipulate the adults into being triangulated. And I know that some parents out there are going, all kids triangulate, right? There's cartoons out there where with the classic, go ask your mother. My mom said yes, now dad, would you do it? And of course mom hadn't said yes. It's a running parent joke for everybody, but we're talking about a different level of triangulation here. These children, they have an intense need, and they're often masters at this triangulation, and they use it in bold ways. And I'm not saying that to, judge the child. I'm just saying this is what a lot of the adults living with children who have attachment disorders deal with on a regular basis. Any adult taking an interest in the child is likely to get an earful of stories about their parent or caregiver, right? What they are doing, what they aren't doing, how they're treating them, they don't love them, all kind, usually skewed towards the negative because their thought process, their internal belief is negative. And that makes that adult kind of start wondering, right? And in some cases, you also get the story about what their teachers or the other adults around them are or aren't doing. And sometimes these statements could have connection to their past abuses and adversities because they have experienced a lot, some of them in their young lives. And so they've seen a lot of things that aren't necessarily happening in your home or your school, but sometimes those topics bubble up. And triangulation has resulted in many calls to Child Protective Services and lots of stress for parents and families, and hardships between educators and families or other community services and families. And so it is a problem.
Yeah.
If you're a caregiver of a child who uses triangulation, my advice, parent to parent, would be to be as proactive as you can be. If you know this is likely to happen, communicate with the adults in your child's world, the teachers, the Sunday school teachers, the coaches, the whomever, right? And keep working on keeping that communication going among the three of you. I used to tell my child's teacher that I would reach out to her if my daughter came home saying something happened at school that was surprising, that didn't seem to jive with what I thought should be happening at school. That would be the first thing I did, that I would reach out to the teacher just to verify that this had indeed happened before I let myself get worked up about that. Mm-hmm. I knew my daughter could go that triangulation route, and maybe the teacher had upset her that day in another way. Maybe there was something she was trying to control that I didn't even understand, right? And because I would do that, I would hope that she would do the same for me, that we could have that understanding, that she would, like drop me an email or pick up a phone or text me or something. So checking in with the other adults in the world it's important for couples. It's critical for couples that you and your spouse or whoever you're parenting with, that you're on that same page, right? That you have a way to communicate, because that takes all the fuel out of the triangulation, right? If you know what the other person said and they know what you said, then you can, then you know exactly what's going on. So it
Right.
is a problem, but it's a problem that's best dealt with proactively.
So good. Right. And it's not about catching them in a lie to
No,
punish them.
not at
It's
all.
it's understanding. And actually that leads me to talking about cause and effect thinking, because children with attachment disorders often lack cause and effect thinking. And this is because, at least in part, they're developmentally delayed, both socially and emotionally, and they struggle to predict what others are thinking or feeling. And that's closely tied to cause and effect thinking. And it's strange because often our children are chaos experts, and they recognize very clearly when something happens to evoke chaos, anger, or stress. So they subconsciously recognize, what buttons might get pushed or how to cause the chaos. But really, it's a brain thing. Our brains gravitate to and love repetition. They're always looking for recognizable patterns and things that they've experienced before. But because these kids have challenges with cause and effect thinking, it makes it really tough for them to predict what's going to happen next in a story or in real life situations. And it also makes it very unlikely that they'll successfully pick up on their peers' social cues. And it serves the basis for our children not being able to answer why questions about their own behavior. Why
Mhm.
did you do that? It's never a helpful question. I know this because I've been guilty of it and didn't get the response I was wanting, right? Um, if you are parenting a child of an attachment disorder, don't ask them why. They don't know why. But they do detect your distress when you ask.
Yeah. The quickest way to get something that isn't true or accurate is to ask them why. Because
Yeah. So you're
there's
causing the problem.
yeah, they're
Yeah.
scrambling for an answer
Yeah.
and they don't know. And it's just easier for you to, yeah. But like all the other parents, I had to do it several times before I
Mm.
figured it out. Right. Right. Probably one of the most distressing things about children with attachment disorders is their lack of empathy. And that, at least it was distressing for me. And when I see it on checklists and descriptions, it's like, oh man, that lack of empathy. That's part of what makes the diagnosis controversial. I think it's part of what makes people try to shy away from the diagnosis, is because it sounds really scary to lack empathy, right? It results in their hurting other children or pets or attempting very risky behaviors. And we don't even have to go to the nth of that, all of that, to know that the idea is that people are shocked and surprised by their behaviors. And in
Yeah.
fact, there's an early book on RAD that's called Children Who Shock and Surprise. And now that I look back on it, it was pretty aptly named, right? I distinctly remember the first time that I was shocked at our daughter's behaviors. Parents are often so distressed about this and want to escape this decision, that this whole situation around this, that the lack of empathy becomes an overriding concern. You start to get obsessed on it, and you either get obsessed on trying to make it stop, or you get obsessed on denying that it's happening. I've seen it go both ways, like that. So it's shocking, for example, when a child hurts a small animal or pet, right? And the first step is for the caregiver to, in that situation, is to recognize that it's happening, right? To actually say, okay, this is really happening. And if it happened once, it's likely that it's going to happen again. And so what am I going to do about this? And the main thing that you're going to do about this, the very main first thing, is to keep everybody in your house safe, including the pets and the animals. And that often means that you're going to have to do something like moving the pet away from the child, and moving the pet maybe even away from the family. And I know those of us who've been there, it's a hard thing. Yeah, but it's best to recognize the reality for what it is. The second step, and this is sometimes much harder, is to not convey your shock to the child as much as possible, because that shock conveys a reaction that, that has to do with the chaos and all of those things. So in some ways, it appears almost as if the child is pleased that they are at this chaotic point, because remember, their brains are used to that, right? But underneath all of that, it conveys the reaction of shame and fear, right? One or the other, maybe both. That the child is shame-filled now, or fear-filled, because now I've done something to this relationship that I'm starting to build and maybe trust, and now I've done something, and my parents, are recoiled at that, and they no longer, they're shocked and they're pushed away, and we don't want that to happen, right? That something that can be more of a harmful behavior, more manipulation, all of that aggression, the shutting down, all of those things can come up if they see that you're shocked. Then all of their negative fight, flight behaviors can start. So the wisdom that was given to me by an experienced therapist was that, of course, we wanted this behavior to stop. And more than anything, we wanted our child to have healthy empathy. That's a huge thing, right? Yeah. But the way to build that empathy was through nurturing her and being empathetic to her, not being shocked and recoiling from her, right? I wasn't helping her with that push away of that visceral feeling that I was feeling at her actions. I was helping her most if I could create situations where her lack of empathy was less likely to hurt others. I also couldn't lecture or punish her for this, because that just made more shame or fear or broke the relationship. And she wasn't going to learn to feel empathy if I was doing those things to her, right? I had to recognize that she truly didn't feel it, didn't feel the empathy. It wasn't part of her world or self-view. She hadn't had the opportunity to learn how to be empathetic the way my other healthy, attached children had learned in their early infancy of me meeting their needs. So we had to focus on the attachment to get to the empathy. And I'm going to tell you, it's not easy, because some of that stuff is shocking and some of it rocks your world. And you have to start figuring out, how am I keeping people safe? And also, being nurturing to this child. But this is like at the crux of where a lot of us are with attachment disorders. And over months and years, we continued to see an improvement, a great deal of improvement. And I know that's true for others as well.
Yeah, so good. And let me just say, because we just recently did a podcast on empathy, go back and listen, because we can build it and grow it. And there's so much hope there. But I just actually really appreciate you sharing that, Julie, because it is important, and it's one of the scariest things about RAD. People quickly pick up on that lack of empathy and interpret that to mean something like sociopathic.
Yes.
And that is very scary for any parent.
Yeah, it sure is. Yeah, and the truth is that more and more research is pointing towards unhealed attachment disorders actually playing roles in personality disorders, but not necessarily sociopathic, although I guess it could be borderline personality, narcissism, those kinds of things. But again, if we're talking about 1% to 2% of the population has an attachment disorder, remember how rare they are. And we're also talking about, let's recognize them quickly, and let's work on healing them in the children early so that we don't have ongoing problems.
Right.
That's where the focus is.
The focus and the hope. So good. I don't want us to end this podcast without talking about about developmental trauma disorder. This is a proposed disorder from Dr. Bessel van der Kolk and others at the National Child Trauma Stress Network. For several years, they've conducted research and refined the conceptual framework of a disorder that includes not only attachment, but affect regulation, dissociation, behavioral control, cognition, and self-concept. Developmental trauma disorder isn't currently in the DSM, but it is being more frequently adopted to explain the challenges of children who have problems with more than just attachment. and have the background of insufficient caregiving. This diagnosis also bridges the gap of how children manifest their trauma versus how PTSD is typically identified in adults.
Recognizing that the impact early relational trauma has on a developing brain is important. And so is being able to tie that to somatic dysregulation, to pain, to aversion of sounds, to extreme dysregulation. There's also a recognition that dissociation can be a key aspect of this, as well as both hypovigilance and hypervigilance. Despite not being in the manual yet, developmental trauma disorder is becoming a recognized disorder and leading to more holistic interventions and wraparound supports for the wider impact these early adversities have on our most vulnerable children.
Yeah. And so we will be diving deeper into topics surrounding attachment disorders and are planning on an episode later this season specifically about what attachment disorders can look like at school and what teachers and others in the schools should know. So check our show notes for resources through ATN and others for children with attachment disorders.
We'll catch you all next time. Thanks for listening.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of Regulated and Relational. In our next episode, Julie and Ginger sit down with Barb Clark to dive deep into the diagnosis of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. A special thanks to Joe Kramer for donating the music. To learn more about the Attachment and Trauma Network, visit us at www.attachtrauma.org. I'm Lauren Cassis, and as always, thank you for listening.